Hey guys, and welcome back to the next tutorial. So today we're going to do something very fun. For my friends out there who are fans of Game of Thrones, today we are going to build a Game of Thrones game, yet at the same time we're going to learn how a while loop works. So here's the objective of the game today. What we're going to do is we're going to pick a character at random from a list that I've created of 10 of some of Game of Thrones' biggest characters, who is going to be the person who took out the Night's King. And at random, the tool is going to actually go and pick one random name, even though we know who did it in real life. And for the ones who haven't seen Game of Thrones yet, I'm not going to ruin it for you. So we're going to pick a character at random every single time we run the game. And you have a certain number of guesses where you have to guess who did it. And every single time you guess wrong, there are a certain number of people that just go away or die in Westeros. And so we're going to start off with a certain population. We'll call it, 50 or 100 people or something like that. Every time you guess wrong, a certain number of people go away or die. I hate using the word die, but that's what Game of Thrones is all about. After everybody's dead, you lose the game because there's nobody else to protect. So we're going to use this fun game to not only learn how while loops work, but at the same time, we're going to build this thing for fun. So, I've got my characters of 10 people. And if you don't know what Game of Thrones is, shame on you. No, I'm kidding. If you don't know what Game of Thrones is, it's just a really top-selling HBO show. Very good. Check it out on Google or YouTube or somewhere. But for those of you who are fans, this list is not going to be a surprise to you at all. So, to build our game, what we're going to do at first is I need to pick a name at random. So I'm going to go ahead and import the random module. And out of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to store this warrior's name. So whomever this warrior is going to be. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say that this person's we're going to, like I said, randomly pick this person. So we're going to say random choice. And we'll say from the list, got warriors. And so just to show you the fact that every single time we run this, it's going to be random, we're going to go ahead and print. So the first time, it's going to say Dany. And for those of you who don't know, Dany is just short for Daenerys. But anyway, so next time, let's run this. It's going to say Bran. It's going to say Sansa. So we know that that part of the code is working, or it's picking a random name every single time. And so eventually, when we run the game, we're going to have to hide that. But for now, let's just go ahead and use this. So the next thing we need to define is the population in Westeros. West pop, and we'll just say 100 people to make it easy. All right, so we have 10 people, we have 100 population, so every single time you guess wrong, 10 people die. And so we're going to have to account for that somehow as well. We're going to have to take your guess, and we're going to have to store that somewhere. So for now, we'll go ahead and store that in an empty list. And so now let's write some kind of a function. So the way the while loop works is when I say while, and I'm just going to briefly go over the way the while function works. So I can say something like, so we're going to ignore this just for a second. This was just set up for our game, but very quickly, just sort of like an intermission here. But if I say, I is equal to 0, for example, and I say while I is less than 10, print I, but at the same time, increment I. And so what that means is that every single time I go through this loop, I'm going ahead and incrementing I. So if I just quickly hide this stuff because I don't want it to print in the background, you notice that what it's going to do is it's going to start with I is equal to 0. It's going to go through this loop. It's going to say, well, okay, if I is 0, it's less than 10. Great, so I'm going to print it. And the next time I'm going to increment I, it's going to be 1. Great, I'm going to print it all the way until 9 because as soon as I hit 10, that condition is met. So the shorter form to write this is just equal to I plus equals 1. It means the same thing. So again, if I run this, you get the same result. So really all the while condition is doing is it's going to keep running everything within that code, within that loop, until this condition at the top is met. All right, so keeping that in mind, we're going to go ahead and uncomment this, and we're going to continue forward with our Game of Thrones game. All right, cool. So we've gone ahead and defined some input variables and some basic information. So now, if we were to write out our criteria, there's a few things we want to do. We want to say first, if the population equals 0, and then game over. So that's the first thing. If I've guessed so many times that my population is now dead, everybody's dead, so obviously the game is over. So that's one thing we want to keep in the back of our mind. The second thing we want to say is that if the guess is equal to the character, then stop the game because they won. And then at the same time, as they win, so despite how many guesses or after how many guesses they get, we also want to print out how many people survived. So what I mean by that is, if say I'm 5 guesses in, technically speaking, 50 people have died, 50 people are left. If I'm 6 guesses in, then 40 people are left, 60 people have died. So I want to be able to sort of let the user know how good or bad they've done from that perspective as well. And then the last criteria is that for every wrong guess, we want to decrement the population by 10. And that is simply because we have 100 people and we've decided that we've got 10 characters, so the maximum they can really go is 10. And in which case, if this criteria here leads to this criteria, then again, the game is over as well. So how do we go about to encode that? So we're going to need a whole bunch of while statements. We're also going to need a couple of if statements. I'm going to first go ahead and say something like this, which is while true. I'm going to explain what that means in just a second. And then we're going to have our different criteria here. So we're going to say if Westeros population is equal to 0, then print, sorry, everybody is dead, game over. Something like that, just to let the user know, hey, listen, you stink at this game, and so game is over. The other thing about a while loop, which I didn't mention earlier, is that as I'm going through these if statements, you also want to use something called break only where it's applicable. And what that means is that if this condition is met, and after I've printed this out, I don't need to go down the rest of the loop. I just want to break out of the loop and get out of the while loop. So we're going to get into how that is actually interpreted in just a second. The other thing I need to put in first here is also your guess. So your guess, and we're going to say input, who did it? And then I'm also going to add in, if you remember from a previous tutorial, this word lower. And what that means is, if you notice, all the names that I have in here are in lowercase. So if I put in Jamie with a capital J, or if I put in Jorah all in capitals, it'll just lower everything so that it matches everything there. We don't want to penalize a person for having proper grammar because you're supposed to start a name off with a capital, and I didn't, obviously. But just for simplicity, we're gonna leave everything in smaller case, and then we're gonna convert their input automatically into smaller case and store that in the variable called your guess. So the next thing we can say is elif, if you remember back from our if statement tutorial, elif your guess is equal to kill the Night King. So in this case, what we're saying is if they actually guessed it right, we're just going to say print you won for now. And we're going to say break because there's no need to go back to the loop. And then we're going to say else, finally, if none of this happens, else we're going to say decrement the Westeros population. So minus equals 10. So here's what this code is saying. What it's saying is when I go ahead and put in my input, which is right here, it's going to first say, is my population already equal to 0? The first try it's not going to be because it's 100. So I don't have to worry about it. And so I don't have to worry about this. It's going to automatically bypass this. The second elif, it's going to say, okay, well, if I guess this correctly, I actually say that, let's say the system says that Sam is the killer and I guess Sam, then you're just going to print you won. And if neither of those is true, that means I've guessed wrong and I still have another, more tries left, in which case it's going to take the population and decrement it by 10. And in this case, I should also write a print statement showing how many people are left alive. So I'm going to do a formatted print statement and say there are Westeros population people alive in Westeros. And so what this is basically saying is that if none of this is true and I start out with a population of 100, I'm going to drop that population by 10. I'm going to be left with 90. And it's actually going to go ahead and say that there's 90 people left because I already got one answer wrong. So for fun, let's see. Oh, and once I break out of it, I'm going to say thanks for playing. So every time I actually hit break, it's going to forget all of this stuff here and it's going to go directly into here. So let's see how this works so far. So I'm going to say, so what the system is saying is that it's Brienne. All right, so I'm just going to put in Arya. It's going to say there are 90 people alive in Westeros. That means that I haven't got the name right yet. Let's say Danny. There are 80 people alive in Westeros. And let's say I say now it's actually Brienne. You won. Thanks for playing. Not bad. But what if I wanted to take this slightly a step further? And now what I said is I'm going to go back and explain to you what while true means. While true means is that because there's a whole bunch of if and else statements in here, it's going to say that as long as all of these conditions are met, continue doing the while loop. And that's all it means. I could have simply written something like this, and it would still work, and I'll show you. So I'm going to say while this is not true, so it's the same thing as saying while I haven't guessed the answer right, so if I go ahead and run this, it's going to say John, I can say, Brienne, I can say Aria, and then when I guess John, it's going to do the exact same thing. But rather than having such a big clunky code, it's just easier to say that while all these conditions are true, continue and keep running the code. But what we haven't tried yet, and I've purposely done this in the code, is to sort of trip us up. But I'm going to keep hitting enter until I get to the point where I've got 10 people left. Now let's see what it does, because after I got this name wrong, it should technically say, oh sorry, everybody is dead, so game over. But it says, wait a minute, there are 0 people alive in Westeros. And even if I guess the answer right, which is Theon, it's saying, sorry, everybody is dead. So I guessed them after everybody's dead, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you remember back to one of our previous tutorials, it depends on where you put this statement. So what's happening is even after this gets decremented to the point that it's 0, it's actually not checking for the fact that it's equal to 0 until after the input statement. So we need to change that around. So I actually need to take the input statement and I need to move it after it's checked for it being 0. Now this is going to throw an error because what it's saying is, hang a minute, you have an if statement here, you have an elif here, should this not be indented? So when I run this, it's going to throw me an error. So the way to change this, it's almost like breaking up these into 2 different if statement codes. So when I do something like this, it's going to say, all right, who did it? And as I go down this now, I actually don't get the opportunity to even put anything. Sorry, everybody is dead. Game is over. Thanks for playing. That's exactly what I wanted to do. But remember, one of the things I also said is that if I do guess the name right, I want to know how many people are left, how many people are still alive. So if I go and say John, and now I say Brienne, I wanted to say, hey, there's 90 people left. You won, but there's still 90 people left. So how do we go about and doing that? And it's quite simple. We just say you won. Again, we'll do a formatted print statement here. You won. There are still Westeros population people alive. So if I go ahead and run this again, now it says John, I'm going to say Brienne, Arya, and now when I hit John, it's going to say, you won. There are still 80 people alive. Perfect. That's exactly what I wanted it to do. And so we can almost go back and look at every single type of combination here, and it should work. So if I guess all the wrong names, at 0 it says everybody's dead. Perfect. So that condition is met, which is over here. So that's the first one. This condition is met. Second one is if the guess is equal to the character, stop the game. They won, print how many people survived, which we've already done. So we'll say John and then Sam. All right, I won and there's still 90 people alive. Perfect. Second objective has been met. And then for every wrong guess, we want to decrement the population by 10, which we see that it's actually already been doing. So fairly straightforward to use a while loop as well. So again, if I take this out and I get rid of some of these spaces, we are looking at 20 lines of code to run a really fun little game for Game of Thrones. So if you found this tutorial helpful, please consider liking and subscribing. But it's that simple. We just built a cool Game of Thrones game. So please share this with your friends, put it on your phone, and see what they think. Thanks again for your time. We'll see you in the next video.